From a hole in the ground to splitting atoms, here is the path uranium takes before it becomes reactor fuel. A single kilogram of uranium contains as much energy as roughly 2,700 tons of coal, and that density changes everything about how you think of the tiny ceramic pellets inside a nuclear reactor. Each pellet is about the size of a pencil eraser, yet a year's worth of electricity for a home can be packed into a handful of them. Getting uranium from rock to pellet takes years, crosses continents, and passes through some of the most carefully controlled industrial processes on Earth. The material must be found, mined, milled, converted, enriched, fabricated, loaded into fuel rods, assembled into bundles, used in a reactor, cooled, and eventually stored for the long term. The chain is long because the physics, chemistry, and politics are all tied together. Uranium was first identified in 1789 by the German chemist Martin Heinrich Klaproth, who named it after the planet Uranus. For more than a century, it was mostly used as a pigment in glass and ceramics. In 1938, two Berlin chemists split the uranium atom for the first time. 7 years later, Enrico Fermi's work in Chicago proved that a controlled chain reaction could produce useful heat. The fuel that powers both reactors and weapons is the same element. What separates them is the concentration of uranium-235. Natural uranium is mostly uranium-238 and contains only about 0.7% uranium-235. Reactor fuel needs roughly 3 to 5% U-235. Weapons-grade material is over 90%. That gap is the entire battleground of nuclear technology, and it is called enrichment. Before enrichment can happen, the uranium must be mined and milled. The ore coming out of the ground usually contains only a tiny fraction of uranium by weight. Major producers today include Kazakhstan, Canada, Namibia, Australia, and Uzbekistan. Kazakhstan alone supplies close to 40% of global uranium. Canada's Athabasca Basin contains some of the highest grade deposits on Earth, with ore bodies above 20% uranium by weight. High-grade deposits change the economics and the safety requirements of the entire fuel cycle. Historically, uranium mining changed form as the industry learned more about the element. Early mines were often conventional open pit or underground operations. Later came in-situ recovery, where a fluid is circulated through porous ore bodies underground and uranium is dissolved out without removing the rock. The technique is less visually dramatic than blasting a pit, but it can be cheaper and reduce surface disturbance when the geology is right. Different deposits demand different methods, and that variability is one reason the uranium market is so uneven. At the mine site, the ore is crushed and leached with acid or alkaline solution. The uranium dissolves out of the rock, is filtered, and then precipitated as uranium oxide U3O8. This powder is called yellow cake. Despite the name, it can range from pale yellow to orange-brown and is only mildly radioactive at this stage. It is packed into steel drums and shipped by truck, rail, or ship to a conversion plant. Conversion turns yellow cake into uranium hexafluoride, UF6, usually called hex. That step matters because hex becomes a gas at relatively low temperatures, around 56 degrees Celsius, which makes it suitable for enrichment. The conversion process uses hydrogen fluoride and fluorine gas, both hazardous and corrosive. The UF6 is stored as a white crystalline solid in large steel cylinders that can weigh up to 14 tons. Heated, it sublimates directly into gas. Because UF6 reacts violently with water, moving it safely is a constant engineering challenge. Transport is a whole industry on its own. Yellow cake drums and UF6 cylinders travel under strict labeling, route planning, and security rules because the material is valuable and politically sensitive long before it becomes fuel. Every transfer has to be documented, and every custody change creates another layer of paperwork. That bureaucracy is part of nuclear safety, but it is also part of nuclear politics. The fewer surprises in the chain, the easier it is to keep the material accountable. Enrichment is where the technical and political stakes come together. To go from natural uranium to reactor fuel, the concentration of U-235 must be raised from 0.7% to around 3 to 5%. Because the isotopes are chemically identical, the only useful difference is mass. Early enrichment relied on gaseous diffusion, which pushed UF6 through porous barriers and consumed staggering amounts of electricity. The United States built huge diffusion plants in Tennessee, Kentucky, and Ohio, but the process was inefficient. Gas centrifuges replaced diffusion. They spin UF6 at roughly 50,000 to 70,000 rotations per minute. The heavier U-238 moves slightly outward, while the lighter U-235 concentrates slightly toward the center. One centrifuge only changes the enrichment by a tiny amount, so thousands of them are connected in cascades that feed one stage into the next. The rotors spin continuously, often for years. The engineering is brutal. Rotor walls experience stresses close to the tensile limits of the material. Early machines used high-strength aluminum alloys. Modern versions use carbon fiber composites and specialized steels. Bearings must survive long-term operation at extreme speed. Tiny imbalances can destroy the machine. Only a small number of countries and companies can build these systems reliably, and that knowledge is tightly controlled under export rules. The cascade layout itself is a lesson in industrial patience. A single centrifuge does almost nothing by itself, but when hundreds or thousands are linked and tuned carefully, the whole system gradually concentrates the fissile isotope to the desired level. Operators manage feed rates, tails assays, and product assays so the plant produces exactly the enrichment level the reactor customer needs, no more and no less. That kind of optimization is what makes enrichment both powerful and expensive. Today, the major enrichment suppliers are Urenco, the Russian state corporation Rosatom, and China's CNNC. The geopolitics of enrichment became even more visible after Russia's invasion of Ukraine, when Europe and North America began talking more seriously about reducing dependence on Russian services. Building new enrichment capacity takes years and billions of dollars. Once uranium is enriched, the hex is converted again, this time into uranium dioxide powder, UO2. That powder is the standard fuel form for light water reactors because it has a very high melting point and can tolerate the intense heat inside a reactor core. The powder is pressed into green pellets under high pressure. These pressed pellets are fragile, like compressed chalk, and must be sintered in a furnace at around 1,700 degrees Celsius. During sintering, the pellets shrink, become dense, and emerge as hard ceramic cylinders about 8 millimeters in diameter and 10 millimeters tall. Each pellet weighs about 7 grams, yet each one can ultimately release the energy equivalent of roughly half a ton of coal. Every pellet is inspected for cracks, chips, density, and dimensional accuracy. The tolerances are tight because the pellets must fit inside metal tubes with a controlled gap. A bad pellet can affect an entire fuel assembly. Those pellets are only part of the fuel story. Fabrication plants also grind, inspect, and arrange them so they stack uniformly inside the cladding. The plant must keep dust, humidity, and contamination under tight control because a tiny flaw can change how heat moves through the fuel rod. The manufacturing line is cleanroom precise, even though the material itself will later sit in one of the hottest environments in industrial life. Those metal tubes are cladding. The standard material is a zirconium alloy because zirconium absorbs very few neutrons. That keeps the chain reaction efficient. The tubes are thin, usually just under a centimeter in diameter with walls less than a millimeter thick, and they must be free of defects. Once the pellets are stacked inside, the tube is sealed with welded end plugs. The completed tube becomes a fuel rod. Fuel rods are bundled into assemblies. In a common pressurized water reactor, a typical assembly contains 264 fuel rods in a 17 by 17 grid, along with guide tubes for control rods and instruments. A reactor core contains dozens of such assemblies, loaded into place with millimeter precision using overhead cranes inside a water-filled building. Before any assembly enters a reactor, it goes through dimensional checks, leak testing, and chemical verification. The documentation follows it across borders and through years of record keeping. That paperwork exists because the nuclear fuel cycle is also a non-proliferation system. The International Atomic Energy Agency, created in 1957, inspects declared facilities, installs monitoring cameras, and cross-checks inventories to make sure material stays where it is supposed to stay. It is not perfect, but it is the main technical barrier between civilian fuel production and weapons proliferation. Some reactor designs avoid enrichment entirely. Canada's CANDU reactors use natural uranium and heavy water, which absorbs fewer neutrons than ordinary water. That allows the chain reaction to continue even with only 0.7% U-235. CANDU reactors can also be refueled while running, unlike most light water reactors. That flexibility gives them a very different place in the global fuel cycle. Different reactor designs use different fuel geometries. Russian VVER reactors use hexagonal assemblies, while Western pressurized water reactors generally use square grids. That means fuel from one design usually cannot be swapped into another without major qualification work. Westinghouse has spent years qualifying fuel for VVER reactors so it can compete in that market. Fuel does not enter and leave a reactor all at once. Reactors are refueled on cycles of about 18 to 24 months. Roughly a third of the assemblies are replaced at each shutdown, while the rest are shuffled to even out burnup. Each assembly typically stays in the core through several cycles before it is removed. The refueling outage is one of the most choreographed events in the industry. The reactor is opened under a strict sequence of safety checks, the spent assemblies are moved to a pool, and fresh fuel is placed in precise patterns that engineer the neutron flux for the next cycle. The order matters because the core must stay balanced from the first day of operation to the last. A well-planned reload can improve efficiency, while a bad one can shorten fuel life or stress the reactor more than necessary. When fuel comes out, it is intensely radioactive and still generating decay heat. It goes straight into a spent fuel pool where deep water shields workers from radiation and removes heat. The pool water glows blue because of Cherenkov radiation, the faint light created when particles travel through water faster than light can move through that water. The fuel remains there for years until it cools enough to move. After 5 to 10 years, spent fuel is transferred to dry casks. These are massive steel and concrete containers, sealed under inert gas and cooled passively by air. They require no pumps and no power. In the United States, more than 90,000 tons of spent fuel sit in this kind of interim storage, while the country still lacks a permanent repository. Spent fuel is not pure waste. It still contains unreacted uranium, plutonium created during operation, and other long-lived actinides. France reprocesses spent fuel, extracting plutonium and uranium to make mixed oxide fuel, or MOX, which goes back into reactors. Reprocessing reduces the amount of high-level waste that needs deep geological disposal, but it is expensive and raises proliferation concerns. The United States chose not to develop a civilian plutonium economy, and that choice still shapes its waste policy today. Yucca Mountain in Nevada was studied for decades and then effectively cancelled in 2010. As of now, the United States still has no licensed permanent repository for high-level nuclear waste. Finland and Sweden are further along, with Finland's Onkalo facility under construction. The waste problem remains one of the industry's most persistent, unresolved issues. Advanced reactor designs may change the fuel cycle further. Small modular reactors aim to reduce construction time and cost. Some advanced designs can use spent fuel from conventional reactors, burning long-lived actinides. Molten salt reactors, traveling wave reactors, and fast neutron reactors each approach the fuel cycle differently. None of them are operating commercially at scale yet, but the research reflects a growing push for cleaner, more sustainable nuclear systems. The fuel cycle from mine to reactor to storage is one of the most tightly regulated industrial processes in the world. A uranium atom mined in Kazakhstan might be converted in Canada, enriched in France, fabricated in the United States, and burned in South Korea. Every transfer crosses borders and generates documentation. The system depends on trade routes staying open and international relations remaining stable. That dependence has become more visible since 2022, when disruptions to Russian supply sharpened the debate over where enrichment should happen and who should control it. Nuclear power now supplies about 10% of global electricity. In France, the share is much higher. In the United States, it is around 18% from 93 operating reactors. China is building more nuclear reactors than the rest of the world combined. How those reactors are fueled will shape energy security for decades. The whole chain, from ore blasted from rock to pellets, stacked in rods to assemblies cooled in pools and casks, is a conversion of geological time into electricity. It is not simple or clean, but it is precise. A 1,000-megawatt reactor can run on fuel that fits on a single flatbed truck, while a coal plant of the same size would need millions of tons of fuel each year. The future of nuclear power is still debated. The fuel cycle produces no carbon dioxide during operation, but it does create waste that remains hazardous for tens of thousands of years. Some countries are expanding nuclear power to support decarbonization. Others are shutting reactors down. The science of how the fuel works is settled. What to do with it next is not. The result is an industrial system that turns rock into heat, heat into electricity, and spent fuel into a political problem that will outlast the people who created it. That is the nuclear fuel cycle, precise, powerful, regulated, and still unfinished.